In the grand halls of Ashford Hall, a traditional tea ceremony turns deadly when Sir Henry Grayson collapses, poisoned by cyanide. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets. A bitter family feud, a restless young widow, a loyal servant with a shadowed past, and a hostess hiding financial ruin. As suspicions swirl, a single clue, a tainted teacup, leads to a shocking confession, proving that even the most elegant rituals can conceal a murderer's heart. Dive into this gripping tale of deception and discovery. Chapter 1. The Invitation. In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with predictable grace and the hedgerows bloomed with reliable charm, an unusual ripple of excitement stirred the air. Lady Evelyn Ashford, mistress of Ashford Hall, had announced a traditional tea ceremony, an event as rare as it was refined. The invitation, delivered by post to Miss Jane Marple's neat little cottage on the High Street, was written in Lady Evelyn's elegant, looping script, its formality hinting at an occasion of significance. Miss Marple, with her soft white curls and eyes that missed nothing, read the note with a faint smile, her fingers pausing over the embroidery she was working on. The guest list was small but intriguing. Sir Henry Grayson, a retired diplomat of some repute. His young wife, Clara, known for her beauty but not her patience. Mr. Thomas Reed, the Ashfords' devoted servant, and Miss Lydia Harcourt, a cousin of Sir Henry's, whose name stirred vague whispers of old family scandals. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, prickled. Such gatherings, she knew, often concealed currents beneath their polished surfaces. The morning was crisp, with autumn leaves scattering across the lane, as Miss Marple walked to the vicarage to discuss the matter with her friend, Mrs. Clement. Over a pot of Darjeeling, she mentioned the invitation, her tone light but her eyes keen. "It's curious, isn't it?" she mused, her needles clicking as she worked on a scarf for the church bazaar. Lady Evelyn is not one for ostentation, yet this tea ceremony feels almost deliberate. Mrs. Clement, ever eager for gossip, speculated about Sir Henry's wealth or Clara's rumored discontent, but Miss Marple only nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled Lady Evelyn's reserved demeanor at the last village fete, and the way Miss Harcourt's name had caused a fleeting frown on the vicar's face. There was, she sensed, a story behind this event, one that the invitation's careful wording did not reveal. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village post office, where Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, was a font of local lore. With a few gentle questions, Miss Marple learned that Sir Henry and Clara had arrived at Ashford Hall only the previous week, their visit coinciding with Miss Harcourt's unexpected return to St. Mary Mead after years abroad. Mr. Reed, the servant, was a fixture at the hall, his quiet efficiency noted by all, though Mrs. Baker hinted at a shadowed past, something about a dismissal long ago, quickly hushed up. Miss Marple filed these details away, her mind as orderly as her garden. She declined Mrs. Baker's offer of a second scone, citing a need to prepare for the ceremony, and returned home, her curiosity fully awakened. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights of Ashford Hall glow in the distance. The tea ceremony, with its ancient rituals and precise etiquette, was an odd choice for Lady Evelyn, who preferred bridge parties to such formalities. Was it a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps, or a stage for something else entirely? Miss Marple's fingers moved deftly over her embroidery, but her thoughts were on the guests, each, she suspected, carrying their own secrets to the tea-room. She resolved to attend with her usual unobtrusive presence, her mild demeanor masking the sharp mind that had unraveled so many of St. Mary Mead's quiet mysteries. Chapter 2. The ceremony begins. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Ashford Hall, its golden rays filtering through the tall windows of the tea-room, where preparations for Lady Evelyn Ashford's ceremony were in their final stages. The room, a study in understated elegance, was adorned with polished oak paneling and a single, low table of lacquered rosewood, around which cushions were arranged in a precise semicircle. Delicate porcelain cups, their glaze catching the light, stood ready on a sideboard, alongside a bamboo whisk and a lacquered tea caddy that held the finest matcha, imported at no small expense. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and anticipation, a quiet hum of expectation that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the old house. Miss Jane Marple, arriving punctually at 4 o'clock, stepped into this scene with her characteristic air of mild curiosity, her black lace mittens clutching a small reticule, her eyes taking in every detail with the deceptive softness of a village spinster. Lady Evelyn, resplendent in a silk kimono of deep indigo, greeted her guests with a smile that was both gracious and restrained. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as she welcomed each arrival with a slight bow, her hands folded neatly before her. Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around her hostess's eyes, a detail that might have escaped a less observant guest. Sir Henry Grayson, a tall man with silver hair and a diplomat's polished manner, entered with his young wife, Clara, on his arm. Clara, barely 25, wore a pale green dress that accentuated her delicate features, though her restless fingers toyed with the edge of her gloves, betraying a nervous energy. Mr. Thomas Reed, the servant, glided silently about his duties, his dark suit immaculate, his face a mask of professional deference. Last to arrive was Miss Lydia Harcourt, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her gray eyes darting as she took her place with a murmured greeting. Miss Marple, settling onto a cushion with her knitting bag at her side, felt the undercurrent of tension that ran through the room like a hidden stream. The ceremony began with a quiet reverence, the kind that Miss Marple knew was both a performance and a ritual, rooted in centuries of tradition. Lady Evelyn knelt before the table, her hands moving with practiced grace as she purified the utensils, a bamboo scoop, a silk cloth, the whisk, with slow, deliberate motions. The guests watched in silence, though Miss Marple's eyes strayed to their faces. Sir Henry's expression was one of polite interest, though his gaze lingered on Lady Evelyn with a hint of appraisal. Clara, seated beside him, seemed distracted, her eyes flitting to the window as if longing for escape. Mr. Reed, standing discreetly to one side, adjusted a tray with such precision that Miss Marple wondered at his need to occupy his hands. Miss Harcourt, however, sat with a rigidity that spoke of more than mere formality. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her fingers, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed a tremor. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence, as she catalogued these observations, each a thread in the tapestry of human behavior she was so adept at weaving. Lady Evelyn's voice, soft yet clear, broke the stillness as she explained the significance of the tea ceremony, her words carrying the weight of tradition. "This is a moment of harmony," she said, her eyes sweeping over her guests. A time to set aside the cares of the world and find peace in the simple act of sharing tea. Miss Marple nodded politely, though she privately thought that harmony was a fragile thing in such a gathering. She recalled the whispers she had gathered in St. Mary Mead, the old grudge between Sir Henry's family and Miss Harcourt's, the rumors of Clara's discontent, the shadow over Mr. Reed's past. Harmony, she suspected, was not the true purpose of this afternoon. The preparation of the tea was a ballet of precision. Lady Evelyn measured the vibrant green matcha into a porcelain bowl, her movements as fluid as water. She poured hot water from a kettle, its steam rising in delicate curls, and whisked the mixture until a fine froth formed on the surface. The scent of the tea, earthy and slightly bitter, filled the room, mingling with the cedar. Miss Marple watched closely as Lady Evelyn distributed the cups, each handed to Mr. Reed, who placed them before the guests with a bow. The cups were identical, their pale blue glaze unmarred, yet Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the subtle differences in how each was received. Sir Henry accepted his with a nod, his fingers steady. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering before taking the cup, as if reluctant to commit to the act. Miss Harcourt's grip was tight, her knuckles whitening, while Mr. Reed's face remained impassive as he retreated to his place by the wall. The first sips were taken in silence, the only sounds the faint clink of porcelain and the rustle of Clara's dress as she shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple, sipping her own tea, found it pleasantly bitter, its warmth spreading through her. She observed Sir Henry, who seemed to savor his eyes half closed in appreciation. Clara barely touched hers, setting the cup down with a faint clatter. Miss Harcourt drank quickly, her movements jerky, as if eager to be done with the ritual. Miss Marple's needles paused, her attention caught by a fleeting glance between Miss Harcourt and Sir Henry, a look that held neither warmth nor indifference, but something sharper, something unresolved. The conversation, when it began, was stilted, as if the guests were unsure of their roles in this unfamiliar setting. Sir Henry spoke of his travels in the East, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man accustomed to holding court. "The Japanese have a way of making even the mundane profound," he said, gesturing to the tea bowl. "This ceremony reminds me of Kyoto, years ago." Lady Evelyn nodded, her smile polite but distant, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Clara offered a faint, "How lovely," her voice barely audible, while Miss Harcourt remained silent, her eyes fixed on her cup. Miss Marple, content to listen, noted the undercurrents in their words, the way Sir Henry's anecdote seemed to exclude Miss Harcourt, the way Clara's disinterest bordered on rudeness, the way Lady Evelyn's responses were measured, almost guarded. Mr. Reed moved to replenish the water in the kettle, his steps silent on the tatami mats. Miss Marple watched him, her mind turning over the fragments of gossip she had gleaned. A servant with a past, dismissed once for reasons unclear. Could he have a motive to disrupt this gathering? His deference seemed genuine, yet there was a watchfulness in his eyes, a calculation that Miss Marple recognized from others who lived on the edges of great houses. She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through the housekeeper, who was known to be less discreet after a glass of sherry. As the second round of tea was prepared, Miss Marple's attention returned to Miss Harcourt. The woman's composure was fraying, her fingers now twisting the fabric of her skirt. Miss Marple recalled the postmistress's tale of Miss Harcourt's return to St. Mary Mead, her talk of righting wrongs at the local inn. The Harcourt family, she knew, had once been equals to the Graysons, until a disputed inheritance had left them destitute. Was Miss Harcourt's presence here a step toward reconciliation, or something more sinister? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts as precise as the stitches she formed. Lady Evelyn's voice drew her back to the ceremony. "The tea ceremony is a mirror," she said, her tone almost meditative, reflecting our intentions, our hearts. Miss Marple wondered if Lady Evelyn sensed the discord among her guests, or if her words were merely part of the ritual's script. Sir Henry smiled, but it was a diplomat's smile, polished and unrevealing. Clara's eyes flicked to her husband, then away, her expression unreadable. Miss Harcourt's gaze remained fixed on her cup, as if it held answers she dared not seek elsewhere. The room grew warmer as the sun dipped lower, its light now a soft amber that bathed the tea-room in a golden glow. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the details, the glances, the silences, the subtle shifts in posture. She thought of her own village, where small gestures often betrayed large secrets. A dropped handkerchief, a hasty word, a look held too long. These were the clues that unraveled mysteries, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. She glanced at Lady Evelyn, whose hands trembled slightly as she whisked the next bowl of tea. Fatigue, perhaps, or something more. The ceremony proceeded, each guest receiving a fresh cup. Miss Marple noted the care with which Mr. Reed placed each one, his movements as precise as Lady Evelyn's. Yet there was a moment, brief and almost imperceptible, when his hand lingered near Miss Harcourt's cup, as if adjusting its position. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her face remained placid. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple was not one to dismiss small things. As the guests raised their cups for the second round, Miss Marple felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, a tightening of the invisible threads that bound them. Sir Henry spoke again, his tone lighter now, recounting a humorous incident from his diplomatic days. Clara forced a laugh, too sharp, too quick. Miss Harcourt's silence grew heavier, her eyes now fixed on Sir Henry, with an intensity that Miss Marple found unsettling. Lady Evelyn, sensing the need to restore calm, began to speak of the tea's origins, her voice steady, but her hands still betraying that faint tremor. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a metronome to her thoughts. She considered the dynamics of the group, the old family feud, the young wife's restlessness, the servants' shadowed past, the hostess's hidden strain. Each was a piece in a puzzle, and though the picture was not yet clear, Miss Marple knew that the tea ceremony, with its rigid structure and intimate setting, was the perfect stage for secrets to surface. She sipped her tea, its bitterness a reminder of the task ahead, and resolved to watch closely, for in St. Mary Mead, as in Ashford Hall, harmony was often a fragile illusion. Chapter 3. The Fatal Sip. The tea-room at Ashford Hall, moments ago a haven of ritualized calm, descended into chaos with a suddenness that seemed to shatter the very air. The second round of matcha had just been served, the porcelain cups steaming gently in the amber light of the late afternoon. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles momentarily still, had been observing the subtle interplay of glances among the guests when Sir Henry Grayson, seated across from her, let out a strangled gasp. his face, ruddy from years of good living, twisted in agony. His hands clawed at his throat, the delicate teacup slipping from his fingers to shatter on the polished floor, its contents spilling in a green stain across the tatami. He slumped forward, his body convulsing briefly before going still, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to linger even as life left them. Clara Grayson's scream pierced the silence, high and jagged, as she leapt to her feet, her pale green dress catching the light. Lady Evelyn Ashford, poised at the head of the table, froze, her hands hovering over the tea bowl, her face a mask of shock. Mr. Thomas Reed, the servant, moved swiftly to Sir Henry's side, his usual deference replaced by a brisk efficiency as he checked for a pulse, his fingers trembling only slightly. Miss Lydia Harcourt remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on the fallen man with an expression Miss Marple could not quite decipher. Horror, perhaps, or something colder. Miss Marple herself, though startled, felt her mind sharpen, her senses attuned to every detail, the faint, bitter scent in the air, the glint of broken porcelain, the rapid breathing of the guests. "Henry!" Clara cried, collapsing beside her husband, her hands fluttering uselessly over his still form. "Oh God, what's happened?" Her voice broke, and she looked to Lady Evelyn as if expecting an answer. Lady Evelyn, recovering her composure, rose and moved toward the door, her kimono rustling softly. "We must fetch Dr. Haydock at once," she said, her tone firm despite the pallor of her cheeks. Mr. Reed, already on his feet, nodded and slipped from the room, his departure so silent it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. Miss Marple, her knitting bag set aside, knelt beside Sir Henry, careful not to disturb the scene. Her fingers, steady despite her age, brushed the edge of the shattered cup, noting its position relative to the table. The tea's bitter aroma was overlaid with something sharper, acrid, that did not belong. She glanced at the other cups, still resting before their owners, and saw that Clara's was nearly untouched, while Miss Harcourt's was empty, its interior stained with the last dregs of matcha. Lady Evelyn's cup, like Miss Marple's, held a small amount, sipped but not finished. A pattern, perhaps, or mere coincidence. Miss Marple knew better than to decide too soon. Dr. Haydock, a brisk man with a reputation for competence, arrived within the hour, his black bag in hand. The tea-room, now oppressively silent, seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. He examined Sir Henry's body, his face growing grim, as he noted the cyanosed lips and the faint, almond-like odor that Miss Marple had already detected. "Cyanide," he pronounced, his voice low but certain. "Administered recently, likely through ingestion. Death would have been near instantaneous." Clara let out a sob, burying her face in her hands, while Lady Evelyn's lips tightened, her eyes darting to the scattered fragments of the teacup. Miss Harcourt remained still, her gaze now fixed on the floor, as if unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Inspector Craddock, summoned from the county police, arrived shortly after, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene. A practical man, he was known to Miss Marple from previous cases in St. Mary Mead, and she noted the flicker of recognition in his eyes as he spotted her among the shaken guests. "Miss Marple," he said, with a nod that held both respect and wariness. "I might have known you'd be here." She returned a small smile, her demeanor as unassuming as ever, though her mind was already sifting through the details of the afternoon. Craddock's questions were methodical, his notebook filling with the guests' halting responses. Lady Evelyn, her voice steady but her hands clasped tightly, described the ceremony's progression, emphasizing its strict adherence to tradition. "The tea was prepared before everyone, Inspector," she said. "The utensils were cleansed in full view, the matcha measured carefully. I cannot imagine how poison could have been introduced." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her voice, a crack in her otherwise impeccable composure. Clara, still tearful, insisted she had seen nothing unusual. Henry was fine, talking about his travels, and then he just... She broke off, her hands twisting her gloves into knots. Miss Marple noted the young woman's distress, but also the way her eyes flicked toward Miss Harcourt, a glance so brief it might have been missed. Was it fear, suspicion, or something else? Clara's youth and evident grief made her a sympathetic figure, but Miss Marple knew that grief could mask other motives. Mr. Reed, questioned next, spoke in a low, even tone, his hands folded behind his back. "I prepared the tea utensils this morning, sir, as Lady Evelyn instructed. I served the cups as they were handed to me. I noticed nothing out of the ordinary." His face was impassive, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers flexed as if resisting some urge. A servant's loyalty was expected, but his calm was almost too perfect, too practiced. Miss Harcourt, when pressed, spoke haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir Henry was a dear friend," she said, her eyes still avoiding the body. "I can't believe anyone would do this." Her words were correct, but Miss Marple sensed a hollowness in them, a performance that did not quite ring true. The old family feud, mentioned in village gossip, loomed in her mind. Had Miss Harcourt's claim of friendship been a facade? As Craddock continued his inquiries, Miss Marple slipped to the edge of the room, her movements unobtrusive. She examined the sideboard where the tea utensils still rested, the bamboo whisk, the silk cloth, the lacquered caddy. Each had been handled by Lady Evelyn or Mr. Reed, but the cups, now gathered as evidence, were the key. The cyanide, Dr. Haydock had said, was ingested, and the shattered cup at Sir Henry's place was the most likely vessel. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the air above the fragments, her mind reconstructing the ceremony's sequence. The cups had been distributed by Mr. Reed, but prepared by Lady Evelyn. Had the poison been in the tea itself, or applied to the cup beforehand? The acrid scent suggested the latter, a method requiring both opportunity and precision. She glanced at the guests, now huddled in their separate corners. Clara, still weeping, was being comforted by Lady Evelyn, whose maternal gestures seemed genuine, yet strained. Miss Harcourt stood alone, her posture rigid, her eyes now fixed on the window as if seeking escape. Mr. Reed, dismissed by Craddock, busied himself clearing the untouched trays, his movements as silent as ever. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a habit that steadied her thoughts. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a poisoned glass of sherry had revealed a family's buried grudges. The tea ceremony, with its intimate setting and rigid protocol, was an ideal stage for such an act, public enough to deflect suspicion, private enough to conceal a sleight of hand. Inspector Craddock approached her, his notebook tucked away. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, his tone half amused, half resigned, "I suppose you've already got a theory or two?" She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old woman who notices things. But I do wonder. Cyanide is such a deliberate choice, isn't it? Not something one keeps in the pantry." Craddock's brow furrowed, and he nodded, recognizing the nudge toward a line of inquiry he had not yet pursued. As the police began to seal the tea room, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the shattered cup. Its fragments, scattered like pieces of a puzzle, held the answer. She was certain of it. The ceremony's harmony had been a facade, masking tensions that had erupted in murder. She thought of the guests, each with their secrets. Lady Evelyn's strained finances, Clara's rumored lover, Mr. Reed's shadowed past, Miss Harcourt's bitter heritage. One of them had acted, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would unravel the truth, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 4. The Suspects. The air in Ashford Hall had grown heavy, as if the very walls absorbed the shock of Sir Henry Grayson's death. The tea room, now a crime scene, was cordoned off by Inspector Craddock's men, its delicate harmony replaced by the grim efficiency of investigation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room where the guests had been ushered, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting needles moved steadily, a soft counterpoint to the murmurs of the police and the stifled sobs of Clara Grayson. The room, with its high ceilings and faded tapestries, felt too large for the small, shaken group gathered within it. Lady Evelyn Ashford sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but pale. Clara, her eyes red-rimmed, clutched a handkerchief, while Mr. Thomas Reed stood near the door, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Miss Lydia Harcourt perched on the edge of a chair, her fingers twisting a strand of her auburn hair, her gaze flickering nervously. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, took in every detail, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open, began his interrogations with a brisk authority, tempered by the deference due to Lady Evelyn's station. He stood before her, his broad frame casting a shadow across the Persian rug. "Lady Evelyn," he began, "you prepared the tea yourself. Can you confirm that no one else handled the matcha or the utensils before the ceremony?" Lady Evelyn's eyes met his, steady but with a faint glint of something. Pride, perhaps, or defiance. "I prepared everything as tradition demands, Inspector," she said, her voice clear despite the strain of the moment. "The matcha was sealed until I opened it, and the utensils were cleansed in front of the guests. Mr. Reed assisted with the cups, but only after I had finished." Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on after, a subtle shift that suggested Lady Evelyn was protecting her servant, or herself. She recalled the financial troubles whispered about in St. Mary Mead, the mortgages weighing on Ashford Hall. Could desperation have driven Lady Evelyn to such an extreme act? Her mastery of the tea ceremony gave her opportunity, but her demeanor, so controlled, suggested a woman who valued dignity above all. Craddock turned to Clara Grayson, who flinched under his gaze as if struck. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, his tone softening, "you were seated beside your husband. Did you notice anything unusual about his cup or his behavior before he collapsed?" Clara's hands twisted the handkerchief into a tight knot, her voice trembling as she spoke. "No, nothing. Henry was talking, laughing even, about some trip to Japan. He drank his tea, and then, oh, it was so sudden." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the handkerchief, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the genuine grief in Clara's sobs. but also the way her eyes darted toward Miss Harcourt before returning to her lap. Clara's youth and beauty made her a natural object of sympathy, but Miss Marple knew that tears could conceal as much as they revealed. The village gossip about Clara's discontent, her rumored lover in London, lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Had she grown tired of her older husband, or was her distress as real as it appeared? Mr. Reed was next, his responses delivered with the precision of a man accustomed to serving without drawing attention. "I handled the cups only to place them before the guests, sir," he said, his voice low and even. "I fetched the water and arranged the trays, but I touched nothing after Lady Evelyn prepared the tea." Craddock pressed him, asking about his movements before the ceremony, but Reed's answers remained measured, his face betraying nothing. Miss Marple, however, caught the slight clench of his hands behind his back, a gesture that spoke of tension beneath his calm exterior. She recalled the housekeeper's tale of Reed's dismissal from a previous post, a matter of theft swept under the rug. Was he merely a loyal servant, or did he harbor a grudge, perhaps against Sir Henry, who had been a guest at other great houses where Reed had served? Miss Lydia Harcourt, questioned last, seemed to shrink under Craddock's scrutiny. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible, her words chosen with care. "I was honored to be invited," she said, her gray eyes fixed on the floor. "Sir Henry and I had grown close again, after some years apart. I saw nothing unusual, nothing at all." Her fingers continued to twist her hair, a nervous habit that Miss Marple found telling. The old family feud, a tale of disinheritance and bitterness, was well known in the village. Miss Harcourt's claim of reconciliation with Sir Henry seemed plausible, yet her evasiveness suggested otherwise. Had she come to Ashford Hall with a purpose beyond polite civility? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts turning over the possibility of a motive rooted in long-buried resentment. Craddock, satisfied for the moment, dismissed the group to their rooms, though he instructed them to remain in the house. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the drawing room. The police had taken the tea utensils for analysis, but the memory of the ceremony was vivid in her mind. The precise movements of Lady Evelyn's hands, the silent efficiency of Mr. Reed, the restless unease of Clara, the guarded intensity of Miss Harcourt. Each had been in a position to tamper with Sir Henry's cup, yet the cyanide's delivery required both opportunity and intent. Miss Marple considered the logistics. The poison, swift and deadly, must have been introduced during or just before the ceremony. The cups, identical in appearance, had been distributed by Mr. Reed, but prepared by Lady Evelyn. Could an outsider have slipped into the tea room unnoticed? Unlikely, given the house's staff and the ceremony's intimate setting. She approached Inspector Craddock, who was conferring with a constable near the fireplace. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild, "I wonder if you've considered the timing of the poison. Cyanide acts so quickly. Wouldn't it have to have been in the cup itself, rather than the tea prepared for all?" Craddock's eyebrows rose, and he nodded slowly, jotting a note. "A fair point, Miss Marple. We're testing the fragments of Sir Henry's cup, and the others, to be sure, but the tea was shared from the same bowl, so the cup seems the likely culprit." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as unassuming as ever, though her mind was racing. The cup, then, was the key, a small, deliberate act of malice, hidden in the ritual's formality. As she made her way to the guest room assigned to her, Miss Marple passed the closed door of the tea room, now guarded by a young constable. She paused, her thoughts returning to the village gossip. Lady Evelyn's financial strain, Clara's rumored infidelity, Mr. Reed's murky past, Miss Harcourt's inherited grievances. Each suspect had a potential motive, yet none stood out as the obvious culprit. Miss Marple knew from experience that the truth often lay in the smallest details. A glance, a gesture, a word spoken out of turn. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a poisoned cake had revealed a sister's jealousy, concealed behind a smile. This murder, she sensed, was no less personal, no less rooted in the quiet resentments that festered beneath polite surfaces. Settling into her room, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her fingers finding the familiar rhythm of the needles. The house was quiet now, save for the distant murmur of police voices and the occasional creak of old floorboards. She thought of the tea ceremony, its promise of harmony shattered by a single act of violence. Someone in this house had planned Sir Henry's death, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was determined to uncover them. The threads of suspicion were many, but she would weave them together, stitch by careful stitch, until the pattern emerged. Chapter 5. The Family Dispute. The morning after Sir Henry Grayson's death dawned gray and heavy, the sky over Ashford Hall cloaked in clouds that seemed to mirror the somber mood within. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small writing desk in her guest room, sipped a cup of tea brought by a subdued housemaid. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind occupied with the threads of motive and opportunity that had begun to emerge. The police, under Inspector Craddock's direction, were combing the tea room and questioning the staff, but Miss Marple knew that the heart of this mystery lay not in physical evidence alone, but in the tangled relationships of those present at the fatal ceremony. Her thoughts turned to Miss Lydia Harcourt, whose guarded demeanor and evasive answers had caught her attention. The whispers of a family feud, mentioned in passing at the village post office, demanded exploration, and Miss Marple resolved to pursue this lead with her characteristic quiet persistence. After breakfast, served in a dining room where the clink of cutlery felt unnaturally loud, Miss Marple sought out the housekeeper, Mrs. Norris, a woman whose loquacity was well known in St. Mary Mead. She found her in the pantry, overseeing the polishing of silver with a critical eye. "Mrs. Norris," Miss Marple began, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze, "I couldn't help but overhear at the vicarage that Miss Harcourt and Sir Henry had a history. Something about their families, perhaps?" Mrs. Norris, flattered by the attention of the village's keenest observer, leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's an old story, but a bitter one. The Harcourts and Graysons were cousins, you know, back when both families had money. But Sir Henry's father, old Sir Reginald, cut Miss Harcourt's father out of the will. Something about a quarrel over land, or maybe a debt, left them with nothing, and Miss Lydia's father never recovered. Died a broken man, they say." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. "And Miss Harcourt, has she spoken of this in the village?" Mrs. Norris's eyes gleamed with a thrill of gossip. "Not directly, miss, but she's been seen at the Red Lion, talking to anyone who'd listen about righting wrongs and how the Graysons owed her family. Mind you, she's been civil enough to Sir Henry in public, but there's a look in her eye, like she's nursing a grudge." Miss Marple thanked the housekeeper, her mind cataloging this new piece of the puzzle. A disinheritance, a lifetime of resentment. Such things could fester, turning a distant cousin into a dangerous enemy. Returning to the drawing room, where the guests were permitted to gather under police supervision, Miss Marple observed Miss Harcourt with renewed interest. The woman sat alone by a bookcase, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her hands folded over a small volume she did not appear to be reading. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if guarding against an errant word. Miss Marple, settling into a nearby armchair with her knitting, struck up a conversation with the ease of one long practiced in drawing out secrets. "Miss Harcourt," she said, her voice warm, "I understand you and Sir Henry were cousins. It must have been a comfort to renew your acquaintance after so many years." Miss Harcourt's eyes flicked up, wary, but she managed a tight smile. "Yes, we had drifted apart, but Henry was kind to invite me here. We were putting the past behind us." The hesitation in her words was slight, but Miss Marple caught it, as she caught the way Miss Harcourt's fingers tightened on the book. "Families can be complicated," Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking rhythmically. "In my village, I recall a similar case, a dispute over an inheritance that caused such bad feeling. It's remarkable how old wounds linger, isn't it?" Miss Harcourt's smile faltered, and for a moment her eyes held a flash of something. Anger, perhaps, or fear. "Some wounds don't heal, Miss Marple," she said softly, "but I had no wish to harm Henry. He was family." The words were correct, but their delivery lacked warmth, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in Miss Harcourt's hands as she set the book aside. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a turn in the gardens, her shawl draped over her shoulders against the autumn chill. The rose beds, still in bloom, offered a quiet space to think, and she paced slowly, her mind turning over the Harcourt-Grayson feud. Sir Henry's father, Sir Reginald, had been a formidable figure, known for his ruthlessness in business and family alike. The disinheritance of Miss Harcourt's father, if true, would have left a deep scar, especially for a daughter raised on tales of lost privilege. Miss Marple recalled a conversation at the church fete where the vicar had mentioned Miss Harcourt's return to St. Mary Mead after years abroad, her demeanor proud but strained. Had she come to Ashford Hall seeking reconciliation or revenge? A chance encounter with Clara Grayson interrupted her thoughts. The young widow, her eyes still red from crying, was walking aimlessly near the fountain, her green dress now replaced by a somber gray. Miss Marple, ever gentle, offered a sympathetic smile. "My dear, it must be so difficult for you," she said. Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe he's gone. Henry was everything to me." The words were heartfelt, but Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation, the way Clara's gaze drifted toward the house, where Miss Harcourt could be seen at a window. "You and Miss Harcourt seem to know each other," Miss Marple ventured, her tone casual. Clara's lips tightened. "Barely. She was Henry's cousin, not mine. Always talking about the past, as if it mattered now." The edge in her voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple filed it away, wondering if Clara's dislike of Miss Harcourt stemmed from more than mere indifference. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing notes in the library. "Inspector," she said, her voice as unassuming as ever, "have you looked into Miss Harcourt's family history? There's talk of an old dispute with Sir Henry's father. A matter of inheritance, I believe." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he made a note. "I'll have my men check the records, Miss Marple. If there's bad blood, it could explain a lot." She smiled, her expression mild, though her mind was already tracing the next thread. Cyanide, she knew, was not a weapon of impulse. It required planning, access, and a cold determination. Miss Harcourt's bitterness, if it ran as deep as the village gossip suggested, made her a compelling suspect. But Miss Marple was cautious. Motive alone was not enough. She needed evidence, a slip in the carefully woven fabric of Miss Harcourt's composure. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the drawing-room, her knitting resumed. The house was quieter now, the police having finished their initial searches, but the tension among the guests was palpable. Lady Evelyn, passing through, paused to offer tea, her hands still betraying that faint tremor Miss Marple had noticed during the ceremony. Mr. Reed, ever present, moved silently to light the lamps, his face as unreadable as stone. Clara, retreating to her room, cast a final glance at Miss Harcourt, who remained by the bookcase, her book unopened. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch a step closer to the truth. The family dispute, she sensed, was the key to unlocking this murder. But whether Miss Harcourt was its architect or merely a pawn remained to be seen. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen grudges turn deadly before, and she knew that the past, like a shadow, could stretch long into the present. Chapter 6. The Servant's Tale. The second day at Ashford Hall brought a chill that seeped through the stone walls, as if the house itself mourned Sir Henry Grayson's untimely end. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a cup of weak tea, gazed out at the mist-shrouded gardens, her mind turning over the events of the previous day. Her knitting lay in her lap, a half-finished shawl that served as both comfort and camouflage, allowing her to observe without drawing attention. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady command, were still combing the estate, their questions growing sharper as the initial shock of the murder gave way to methodical inquiry. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, lingered on Mr. Thomas Reed, the servant whose silent efficiency during the tea ceremony had been as notable as his reticence under questioning. His past, hinted at in village gossip, beckoned like a half-opened door, and Miss Marple, with her knack for uncovering hidden truths, resolved to peer inside. After a quiet breakfast, where the guests ate sparingly and spoke less, Miss Marple sought an opportunity to speak with Mrs. Norris, the housekeeper, whose earlier revelations about Miss Harcourt had proven so illuminating. She found her in the servants' hall, sorting linens with a vigor that suggested a need to keep busy. "Mrs. Norris," Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "you mentioned Mr. Reed's time in service before Ashford Hall. I wonder if you could tell me more about his difficulties." Mrs. Norris paused, her hands stilling on a folded sheet, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of sharing a choice morsel. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's not my place to gossip, but since you ask, Mr. Reed was let go from Lord Pennington's estate nigh on 10 years ago. Theft, they said, though nothing was proven. A silver candlestick went missing, and Reed was the one they pointed to. No charges, mind you, but he left under a cloud. Lady Evelyn took him on soon after, and he's been loyal as a dog ever since." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was already sifting through the implications. A theft, unproven but damaging, could cast a long shadow over a servant's life, fostering resentment or a need to prove oneself. Had Mr. Reed's quiet competence been a mask for something darker? She thanked Mrs. Norris and made her way to the library, where the morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating rows of leather-bound books. There, she found Mr. Reed polishing a brass candelabra, his movements precise and unhurried. "Mr. Reed," she said, settling into a chair with her knitting, "you've been with Lady Evelyn for some years. I understand. It must be a comfort to serve in such a fine house." Reed's hands paused briefly, but his face remained impassive. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice low and even. "Lady Evelyn has been good to me. I owe her much." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to ease the silence. "It's a rare thing, loyalty," she continued, her tone conversational. "In my village, we had a butler once, dismissed unfairly for a theft he didn't commit. It left him quite bitter, poor man. I imagine it's hard to shake such a stain." Reed's eyes flicked toward her, a fleeting glance that held a spark of wariness. "I've had no complaints here, Miss Marple," he said, resuming his polishing. "My past is behind me." The words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the cloth a fraction too tightly. A man with nothing to hide, she thought, would not guard his words so carefully. Her thoughts returned to the tea ceremony, where Reed's deft hands had distributed the cups with practiced ease. The cyanide, Inspector Craddock had confirmed, was likely in Sir Henry's cup, not the tea itself, a method requiring access to the utensils before or during the ceremony. Reed, as the one who handled the cups, had opportunity. But what motive? Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's quiet resentment had led to a poisoned well, his anger rooted in years of perceived slights. Could Reed harbor a grudge against Sir Henry, perhaps from a past encounter in another household? Sir Henry, as a diplomat, had moved in circles where Reed might have served, and a slight, real or imagined, could have festered. Seeking more information, Miss Marple ventured to the village that afternoon, her shawl wrapped tightly against the damp air. At the Red Lion, where the locals gathered over pints and gossip, she found Mr. Baxter, the innkeeper, polishing glasses behind the bar. With her usual tact, she steered the conversation to Ashford Hall. "Mr. Reed seems a steady sort," she remarked, "but I hear he had some trouble before coming to Lady Evelyn's service." Mr. Baxter, eager to share, leaned closer. "Aye, Miss Marple, there was talk. Reed was at Pennington's when Sir Henry was a guest there, years back. Some say Sir Henry caught him with that candlestick and insisted he be sacked. No proof, mind, but Sir Henry wasn't one to let things slide. Reed never spoke of it, but you don't forget a thing like that." This new detail sharpened Miss Marple's focus. A past encounter with Sir Henry, resulting in Reed's dismissal, provided a motive as compelling as Miss Harcourt's family feud. She thanked Mr. Baxter and returned to Ashford Hall, her mind turning over the possibilities. Reed's loyalty to Lady Evelyn was evident, but loyalty could coexist with private grievances. Had he seen Sir Henry's visit as a chance to settle an old score? The tea ceremony, with its rigid protocol, offered a perfect cover for a subtle act of revenge. The poison slipped into a cup during the bustle of preparation. Back at the hall, Miss Marple observed Reed as he served tea in the drawing-room, his movements as silent and precise as ever. Lady Evelyn, presiding over the tray, thanked him with a nod, her face still pale but composed. Clara Grayson, seated nearby, sipped her tea absently, her eyes distant. Miss Harcourt, absent from the gathering, was reportedly resting in her room, a detail Miss Marple found convenient. She approached Reed as he cleared the cups, her voice mild. "You must find these rituals comforting, Mr. Reed, after such a tragedy." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It's my duty, ma'am," he said simply. But Miss Marple caught the faint flicker of his eyes toward the door, as if he longed to escape her scrutiny. Later, she shared her thoughts with Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing reports in the library. "Inspector," she said, her tone as unassuming as ever, "have you looked into Mr. Reed's history with Sir Henry? There may be a connection from his time at Lord Pennington's estate." Craddock's eyebrows rose, and he made a note. "You're full of surprises, Miss Marple. I'll have my men dig into it. If Reed had a grudge, it could explain how the cyanide got into that cup." She smiled, her needles clicking, knowing that the truth was often found in the quiet corners of human experience, corners she was adept at exploring. As evening settled over Ashford Hall, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resumed. The servant's tale, like Miss Harcourt's feud, was another thread in the intricate web of this murder. Reed's opportunity was clear, his motive plausible, but Miss Marple knew that assumptions could mislead. She thought of Lady Evelyn's strained finances, Clara's rumored lover, and Miss Harcourt's bitterness, each a potential key to the puzzle. The cyanide, so deliberate a choice, pointed to a calculated mind, and Reed's silent efficiency made him a figure to watch. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how the quiet ones could harbor the deepest secrets, and she suspected that Mr. Reed's tale, like the tea ceremony itself, concealed more than it revealed. Chapter 7. Clara's Motive. The third day at Ashford Hall dawned with a persistent drizzle, the gray skies casting a pall over the estate that matched the growing unease among its occupants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, watched the rain trace patterns on the window panes, her mind as active as her needles. The investigation into Sir Henry Grayson's murder had settled into a rhythm of quiet intensity, with Inspector Craddock's men moving through the house like diligent ants, cataloging evidence and taking statements. Miss Marple, however, was drawn to the human currents beneath the surface, and her thoughts now turned to Clara Grayson, the young widow whose grief seemed genuine, yet tinged with something less straightforward. The village gossip, ever a reliable source in St. Mary Mead, had hinted at Clara's discontent in her marriage, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for hidden truths, resolved to explore this thread further. Clara had kept to herself since the tragedy, her appearances in the drawing-room brief and subdued. At breakfast, served in the somber dining-room, she had picked at her toast, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her pale face framed by a simple black dress that accentuated her youth. Miss Marple, seated across from her, had offered a gentle word of condolence, noting the way Clara's fingers tightened around her teacup, as if bracing against an unseen pressure. "It must be so hard, my dear," Miss Marple had said, her voice soft with sympathy. Clara's response was a murmur. "He was so good to me." But her eyes had darted away toward the window as if seeking refuge in the rain-soaked gardens. Miss Marple, ever observant, sensed a complexity in Clara's demeanor that warranted closer scrutiny. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out the housemaid, Jenny, a young woman with a penchant for chatter who had served Clara's morning tea. In the privacy of the servants' corridor, Miss Marple adopted her most disarming smile. "Jenny," she began, "Mrs. Grayson seems so fragile, poor thing. I wonder if she's spoken of her plans, now that she's lost her husband." Jenny, polishing a brass tray, hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice low. "She's been quiet, Miss Marple, but I overheard her talking to herself in her room last night, something about London and starting anew. And, well, it's not my place, but there was a letter on her dressing table, from a gentleman, I think. I didn't read it, mind, but it looked personal." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild concern, though her mind seized on this detail. A letter, a hint of a life beyond Sir Henry. Could Clara have been planning an escape from her marriage, one that required his permanent absence? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple made her way to the library, where Clara had taken to sitting alone, a book often open but unread in her lap. The room was quiet, its shelves of leather-bound volumes absorbing sound, and Clara sat by a window, her black dress stark against the gray light. Miss Marple approached with her knitting bag, settling into a nearby chair with the air of one seeking a moment's rest. "Mrs. Grayson," she said gently, "I hope I'm not intruding. I find these old libraries so comforting, don't you?" Clara looked up, startled, but managed a faint smile. "Yes, they're peaceful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm, a soothing backdrop to her words. "It must be a comfort to think of the future, even in such dark times," she continued. "Perhaps a change of scene. London, perhaps." Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing her face before she masked it. "I haven't thought that far," she said quickly. "Henry and I were happy here." The denial was too swift, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara's hands twisted in her lap, betraying her unease. She recalled the gossip from the Red Lion, where the innkeeper had mentioned Clara's frequent trips to London, ostensibly to visit a cousin, but often alone. A lover, the whispers suggested, waiting in the wings for Clara to inherit Sir Henry's wealth. Miss Marple, who had seen such motives unravel in St. Mary Mead, knew that a young wife trapped in a marriage of convenience might dream of freedom, and that cyanide could be a ruthless means to achieve it. Yet Clara's ignorance of the tea ceremony's intricacies, evident in her fumbling during the ritual, made her an unlikely poisoner. Had she an accomplice, perhaps, or was her grief a performance to deflect suspicion? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple joined Lady Evelyn for tea in the drawing-room, a ritual that continued despite the tragedy, as if to assert normalcy. Clara was absent, pleading a headache, but Miss Marple seized the opportunity to probe indirectly. "Lady Evelyn," she said, her tone conversational, "Mrs. Grayson seems so young to bear such a loss. I suppose she and Sir Henry were very close?" Lady Evelyn's lips tightened slightly, a gesture Miss Marple did not miss. "They appeared so," she replied, her voice measured. "Clara was devoted in her way, though I believe she found country life rather confining. Henry often spoke of her love for London society." The words were polite, but Miss Marple caught the hint of reservation, as if Lady Evelyn knew more than she chose to say. Returning to her room, Miss Marple reflected on the letter Jenny had mentioned. A discreet inquiry to Inspector Craddock, made as she passed him in the hall, confirmed that the police had found a letter in Clara's room, addressed from a Mr. Charles Wentworth in London. "Nothing incriminating," Craddock said. "Just a friendly note, but we're looking into him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibility that Clara's motive was not merely financial, but romantic. A lover, impatient for her freedom, could have spurred her to act, or acted on her behalf. Yet Clara's evident distress, her hesitance during the ceremony, suggested she lacked the nerve for such a calculated crime. Miss Marple recalled a case in her village where a young woman's lover had poisoned her husband, leaving her to play the grieving widow. Was Clara similarly entangled, or was she merely a victim of circumstance? As evening approached, Miss Marple observed Clara at dinner, where the guests gathered under the watchful eyes of the police. Clara's appetite was poor, her conversation limited to monosyllables, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on Mr. Reed, who served with his usual silent precision. Was it fear, suspicion, or something else? Reed, with his own shadowed past, could have been an ally, or a manipulator. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving a pattern of possibilities. Clara's motive, if it existed, was rooted in her desire for a different life, but the execution of the murder required a steadiness she seemed to lack. Had someone else, sensing her discontent, used it to their advantage? Before retiring, Miss Marple shared her observations with Craddock, her voice as mild as ever. "Inspector, that letter in Mrs. Grayson's room, might it suggest a reason for her to wish Sir Henry out of the way? Young wives, you know, can sometimes dream of freedom." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he made a note. "We're checking Wentworth's background, Miss Marple. If there's a connection, we'll find it." She smiled, knowing that her gentle nudges often set the police on the right path. As she settled into her room, the rain still pattering outside, Miss Marple thought of Clara's youth, her restlessness, and the letter that hinted at a life beyond Ashford Hall. The motive was there, but the means remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her knitting, would require patience to unravel. Chapter 8. Lady Evelyn's Burden. The fourth day at Ashford Hall brought a fragile calm, as if the house, wearied by the turmoil of Sir Henry Grayson's murder, sought to reclaim its dignity. The rain had ceased, leaving the air crisp and the gardens glistening under a tentative sun. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, watched the light play across the ferns, her thoughts as intricate as the patterns she wove. The police, under Inspector Craddock's diligent command, continued their meticulous work, but Miss Marple's focus had shifted to Lady Evelyn Ashford, the poised hostess whose composure masked a strain that grew more evident with each passing day. The village gossip, ever a rich vein in St. Mary Mead, had hinted at financial troubles weighing on Ashford Hall, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for uncovering hidden motives, resolved to explore this new thread in the tapestry of the crime. Lady Evelyn had maintained an air of serene authority since the tragedy, presiding over meals and offering measured responses to Craddock's questions. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, had noticed the faint tremor in her hands during the tea ceremony, the fleeting shadows that crossed her face when Sir Henry's name was mentioned. At breakfast that morning, served in the dining room where the chandeliers cast a soft glow, Lady Evelyn had been gracious but distant, her conversation limited to polite inquiries about the guests' comfort. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had observed the way Lady Evelyn's eyes lingered on the portrait of her late husband, Lord Ashford, a reminder of a time when the estate's future seemed secure. The contrast between her outward calm and inner tension was striking, and Miss Marple sensed that Lady Evelyn's burden was more than mere grief for a guest's death. Seeking to learn more, Miss Marple found an opportunity to speak with Mrs. Norris, the housekeeper, in the privacy of the linen room. With her usual tact, she steered the conversation to the estate's affairs. "Mrs. Norris," she said, her voice gentle, "Ashford Hall is such a splendid place, but I imagine it must be a challenge to maintain. Lady Evelyn carries it all so gracefully." Mrs. Norris, folding napkins with brisk efficiency, sighed. "She does, Miss Marple, but it's a heavy load. The hall's been mortgaged twice over, and there's talk of selling land to pay the debts. Sir Henry, bless his soul, was considering an investment, or so I heard from the butler. His death's put all that in jeopardy." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of sympathetic concern, though her mind seized on this revelation. A financial motive, tied to Sir Henry's potential support, could explain much. If Lady Evelyn had seen his death as a way to preserve her estate, or if his refusal to invest had pushed her to desperation. Later that morning, Miss Marple joined Lady Evelyn for a walk in the gardens, where the roses, still damp from the rain, exuded a faint perfume. The hostess, dressed in a tailored gray coat, moved with her usual grace, but Miss Marple noted the slight stoop in her shoulders, as if the weight of the hall pressed down on her. "Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple began, her tone conversational, "this estate is a treasure. It must take great effort to keep it as it is." Lady Evelyn's smile was tight, her eyes distant. "It does, Miss Marple. My husband loved this place, and I've done my best to honor his memory. But times are difficult, and one must make sacrifices." The words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the hint of strain, the unspoken admission of a struggle that went beyond mere upkeep. They paused by a stone bench, and Miss Marple, settling her shawl, ventured further. "Sir Henry, I understand, was a man of means. I suppose he admired the hall as much as you do." Lady Evelyn's fingers tightened on her gloves, a fleeting gesture. "He was interested in its history," she said carefully. "We spoke of its future, but nothing was decided." The evasion was subtle, but Miss Marple's keen eyes missed nothing. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a landlady, desperate to save her inn, had poisoned a guest whose refusal to lend money threatened her livelihood. Could Lady Evelyn, driven by the need to preserve Ashford Hall, have resorted to such an extreme measure? Her expertise in the tea ceremony gave her unparalleled opportunity to tamper with Sir Henry's cup, yet her pride, so evident in her bearing, seemed at odds with the cold calculation of murder. Returning to the house, Miss Marple observed Lady Evelyn during luncheon, where the guests gathered under the watchful eyes of a constable. Clara Grayson, still pale, spoke little, her gaze fixed on her plate. Miss Harcourt, her auburn hair tightly pinned, seemed more composed but avoided Lady Evelyn's eyes. Mr. Reed served with his usual silent precision, his face a mask of deference. Lady Evelyn, presiding over the table, offered a remark about the weather, but Miss Marple noted the way her hand trembled as she lifted her glass, a sign of nerves that belied her calm exterior. The financial strain, coupled with Sir Henry's potential role as an investor, painted a compelling motive, but Miss Marple knew that motive alone was not enough. The cyanide, applied to the cup's rim, required a moment of opportunity, and Lady Evelyn's role as hostess placed her at the heart of the ceremony's preparations. In the afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing evidence in the library. "Inspector," she said, her voice as mild as ever, "have you looked into Lady Evelyn's financial situation? I understand Ashford Hall is under some strain, and Sir Henry may have been involved in its future." Craddock's eyebrows rose, and he jotted a note. "We've heard rumors of debts, Miss Marple, but nothing concrete. I'll have my men check the estate's records. If Sir Henry's death tied to that, it's a lead worth following." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly, knowing that her gentle prompts often set the police on paths they might otherwise overlook. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a steady rhythm against the quiet. Lady Evelyn, passing through, paused to offer a cup of tea, her hands steadier now, but her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple accepted with a smile, her thoughts turning over the hostess's burden. The mortgages, the need for funds, the possibility that Sir Henry's death ensured the estate's debts remained unpaid, or perhaps freed Lady Evelyn from a creditor's pressure. Yet her dignity, her adherence to tradition, suggested a woman who would not lightly stoop to murder. Miss Marple recalled a case in her village where a proud matron had poisoned a rival to protect her family's name, her calm facade hiding a desperate heart. Was Lady Evelyn such a woman, or was her strain merely the weight of circumstance? The other suspects, Clara's restless ambition, Miss Harcourt's family grudge, Mr. Reed's shadowed past, remained vivid in Miss Marple's mind. But Lady Evelyn's motive, rooted in the preservation of Ashford Hall, was a compelling thread. The tea ceremony, with its intimate setting and precise rituals, had been the perfect stage for a subtle act of violence, and Lady Evelyn's hands, so skilled in its execution, could have concealed a darker purpose. As Miss Marple retired to her room, the house settling into an uneasy silence, she knew that the truth lay in the delicate balance of motive and opportunity, a balance she was determined to uncover, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 9. The Clue in the Cup. The fifth day at Ashford Hall brought a faint lift in the oppressive atmosphere, as if the house, weary of its secrets, yearned for resolution. The sun, breaking through the clouds, cast a pale light across the estate, illuminating the dew-soaked lawns and the somber faces of its occupants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her guest room with her knitting, felt the subtle shift in the air, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Inspector Craddock's investigation had intensified, with forensic experts now analyzing the tea utensils. But Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the physical evidence of the crime, the shattered teacup that had held Sir Henry Grayson's fatal dose of cyanide. The police had gathered the fragments, but Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for detail, knew that the cup itself held secrets yet to be uncovered. Determined to examine it herself, she resolved to find a way to inspect the evidence, trusting that the smallest clue could unravel the mystery. After a quiet breakfast, where the guests exchanged few words under the watchful eyes of a constable, Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock in the library, where he was reviewing reports. Her demeanor was as unassuming as ever, her voice gentle. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if I might have a look at the broken teacup from the ceremony. I know it's in your care, but sometimes an old woman's eyes see things differently." Craddock, accustomed to her uncanny insights, raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I suppose it can't hurt, Miss Marple. The fragments are in the study, under lock and key. I'll have them brought out, but you'll need to be quick. No tampering with evidence." She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles, and followed him to the study, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The study, a small room lined with oak shelves, was guarded by a young constable who stepped aside at Craddock's nod. On a table, sealed in a clear evidence bag, lay the fragments of Sir Henry's teacup, its pale blue glaze catching the light. Miss Marple, her hands steady despite her age, leaned closer, her eyes scanning the jagged pieces. The cup had shattered into a dozen shards, but one fragment, part of the rim, drew her attention. A faint discoloration, barely visible against the glaze, clung to its edge, a residue that seemed out of place, distinct from the green stains of matcha. She pointed it out to Craddock, her voice mild. "This mark, Inspector, could it be the cyanide? Not in the tea, but on the rim itself?" Craddock frowned, peering at the fragment. "We've sent samples for testing, but the lab's backed up. If you're right, it means the poison was applied directly to the cup, not mixed in the tea." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The residue, if it was cyanide, suggested a precise act, one requiring access to the cup before the ceremony began. She recalled the sequence of the tea ceremony. Lady Evelyn preparing the matcha, Mr. Reed distributing the cups, the guests seated in their precise arrangement. The cups had been identical, yet only Sir Henry's had been poisoned. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the moments before the ceremony, when the tea room had been prepared. Mr. Reed had handled the cups, setting them out, but Miss Harcourt had been seen lingering near the tea room earlier that day, as the housekeeper had mentioned in passing. Could she have tampered with the cup, marking it for Sir Henry? Or had Lady Evelyn, with her intimate knowledge of the ritual, found a moment to apply the poison? Miss Marple's needles, resting in her bag, seemed to itch for movement, a reflection of her restless mind. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple observed the guests with renewed focus. Lady Evelyn, presiding over a tray of scones, maintained her air of dignity, though her hands betrayed that familiar tremor. Clara Grayson, her black dress stark against her pale skin, sat silently, her eyes fixed on a book she did not read. Miss Harcourt, more composed today, conversed politely with a constable, her auburn hair catching the light. Mr. Reed, as always, moved silently, clearing plates with a deference that bordered on invisibility. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, recalling his deft movements during the ceremony. The residue on the cup's rim pointed to a deliberate act, one that required both opportunity and intent. Reed, with his access to the utensils, was a natural suspect, but Miss Harcourt's earlier presence in the tea room could not be ignored. Seeking to test her theory, Miss Marple engaged Miss Harcourt in conversation during afternoon tea, her tone as disarming as ever. "Miss Harcourt," she said, settling beside her with a cup, "the tea ceremony was so beautifully done. Did you help with the preparations at all? I imagine it takes many hands." Miss Harcourt's eyes flicked up, a flash of wariness quickly masked. "No, Miss Marple. I only arrived as a guest. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Reed managed everything." The answer was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her fingers tightened around her saucer. A lie, perhaps, or merely discomfort. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a guest's unnoticed visit to a kitchen had led to a poisoned pie. Small moments, she knew, could conceal great crimes. Later, she shared her findings with Craddock, who was growing accustomed to her quiet interventions. "Inspector," she said, "that residue on the cup's rim suggests the poison was applied before the tea was poured. Mr. Reed handled the cups, but Miss Harcourt was near the tea room earlier. It might be worth asking who had access to the utensils that morning." Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "We're checking the staff's statements, Miss Marple. If someone tampered with the cup, they'd need a moment alone. Reed's the obvious one, but I'll look into Miss Harcourt's movements." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, knowing that her gentle nudges often clarified the police's path. As evening settled over Ashford Hall, Miss Marple sat by the fire. In the drawing room, her thoughts circling the clue in the cup. The residue, if confirmed as cyanide, narrowed the method of the crime, pointing to a premeditated act. Lady Evelyn's financial strain, Clara's rumored lover, Mr. Reed's shadowed past, and Miss Harcourt's family grudge each offered a motive, but the cup's rim suggested a single hand, one with access and intent. Miss Marple thought of the tea ceremony, its precise rituals, a perfect cover for a subtle act of malice. Someone had chosen Sir Henry's cup with care, applying the poison in a moment of opportunity. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how the smallest clues, a smudge on a glass, a crumb out of place, could reveal a murderer's heart, and she was certain that the cup, with its faint residue, would lead her to the truth. Chapter 10. The Rival's Confession. The 6th day at Ashford Hall carried a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm, as if the house itself held its breath, awaiting the unraveling of its secrets. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, felt the weight of the mystery drawing closer to resolution. The clue in the shattered teacup, the faint residue on its rim, had sharpened her focus, pointing to a deliberate act of poison applied before the tea was poured. Her thoughts circled Miss Lydia Harcourt, whose guarded demeanor and connection to an old family feud made her a compelling figure in the puzzle. Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and unerring instinct for human nature, resolved to confront Miss Harcourt gently, knowing that truth often emerged when pressure was applied with care. After a subdued breakfast, where the guests exchanged strained pleasantries under the watchful eye of a constable, Miss Marple sought an opportunity to speak with Miss Harcourt alone. The rose garden, with its late blooms still vibrant despite the autumn chill, offered a private setting, and she suggested a walk, her tone as inviting as a neighbor's chat over tea. Miss Harcourt, hesitant but unable to refuse without seeming rude, agreed, her auburn hair catching the light as they stepped into the garden. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and fading roses, and Miss Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, walked slowly, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Miss Harcourt," she began, her voice soft but deliberate, "this garden is so peaceful, isn't it? A place to clear one's thoughts, especially after such a tragedy." Miss Harcourt nodded, her gray eyes wary, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Yes, it's a relief to be outdoors," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. Miss Marple paused by a rose bush, her fingers brushing a petal as she spoke. "I've been thinking about Sir Henry and the old family stories I've heard in the village. Your father, I understand, suffered greatly because of Sir Henry's family. It must have been difficult to carry that history." Miss Harcourt's lips tightened, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her response. "It was a long time ago, Miss Marple," she said, her tone clipped. "I came here to make peace with Henry, not to dwell on the past." But her eyes betrayed her, flickering with a mix of defiance and fear, and Miss Marple, with the patience of one accustomed to unraveling secrets, pressed gently forward. "In my village," she continued, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, "I once knew a woman who carried a similar burden, a family. Wrong that festered for years. She thought to frighten someone, not to harm them, but things went further than she intended. It's surprising how a moment of anger can lead to such consequences." Miss Harcourt stopped walking, her face paling, her hands clenching into fists. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling. Miss Marple met her gaze, her eyes kind but unwavering. "Only that the teacup, with its trace of poison, tells a story. Someone applied cyanide to its rim, and you were seen near the tea room that morning, before the ceremony began." The words hung in the air, and Miss Harcourt's composure crumbled like dry leaves. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank onto a stone bench, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean for him to die," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I only wanted to scare him, to make him feel the fear my father felt all those years. The Graysons ruined us. My father lost everything because of Sir Henry's father, and Henry never cared, never apologized. I thought, a small dose, just enough to make him ill, to force him to face me." Miss Marple sat beside her, her knitting still, her presence a quiet anchor. "And the cyanide?" she prompted gently. Miss Harcourt's tears fell freely now, her words tumbling out. "I got it months ago, from a chemist in London, under a false name. I read about it, thought it would be quick, controllable. That morning, I slipped into the tea room when Mr. Reed was distracted, fetching water. I coated the rim of one cup, the one I knew would go to Henry. He always sat in the same place at Lady Evelyn's table. I thought he'd taste it, stop, but he drank so quickly." Her voice broke into a sob, and she looked at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "I didn't mean to kill him, I swear. I wanted him to suffer, to feel what we felt, and I thought I could blame Clara. Everyone knew she was unhappy, restless. I'm so sorry." Miss Marple's heart ached for the pain in Miss Harcourt's confession, but her mind remained clear. "You must tell the police, my dear," she said, her voice firm yet kind. "The truth is the only way to find peace, for you and for Sir Henry's memory." Miss Harcourt nodded, her tears slowing, and Miss Marple helped her to her feet, guiding her back to the house. They found Inspector Craddock in the library, his notebook open, his face weary but alert. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her tone calm, "Miss Harcourt has something to tell you." She stepped back, allowing Miss Harcourt to speak, her confession halting but complete, detailing the purchase of the cyanide, the moment in the tea room, and her misguided attempt to frame Clara. Craddock listened, his expression hardening as he took notes, though his glance at Miss Marple held a grudging admiration. "Thank you, Miss Harcourt," he said when she finished. "You'll need to come with me to make a formal statement." He signaled to a constable, who escorted Miss Harcourt from the room, her steps heavy but resolute. Miss Marple, left alone with Craddock, resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," Craddock said, shaking his head. "How did you know?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. Oh, Inspector, it's just a matter of noticing the little things. People's eyes, their hands, the way they carry their pain. Miss Harcourt's was too heavy to hide. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her thoughts settling like dust after a storm. The residue on the cup, Miss Harcourt's presence in the tea-room, the old family feud. All had pointed to her, but it was her confession, drawn out by a gentle nudge, that sealed the truth. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's resentment had led to a poisoned letter, his anger blinding him to the consequences. Miss Harcourt, driven by a similar grudge, had acted with more calculation but no less folly. The other suspects, Lady Evelyn's financial strain, Clara's rumored lover, Mr. Reed's shadowed past, had been threads in the web, but Miss Harcourt's was the one that led to the center. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind at peace, knowing that the truth, however painful, had been brought to light. Chapter 11. The resolution, the seventh day at Ashford Hall, broke with a clarity that seemed to cleanse the air, as if the house, relieved of its burden of secrets, could breathe freely at last. The sun, rising over the dew-kissed lawns, cast a golden glow through the tall windows, softening the edges of the somber mood that had lingered since Sir Henry Grayson's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning-room with her knitting, felt the shift in the atmosphere, her mind as calm as the steady rhythm of her needles. Miss Lydia Harcourt's confession, drawn out in the rose garden the previous day, had unraveled the mystery, and the house now hummed with the quiet efficiency of resolution. Inspector Craddock, his investigation drawing to a close, had taken Miss Harcourt into custody, and the remaining guests, Lady Evelyn Ashford, Clara Grayson, and Mr. Thomas Reed, moved through their routines with a mixture of relief and unease. Miss Marple, ever observant, knew that the aftermath of a murder left its own delicate threads to be tied, and she remained watchful, her role in the affair far from over. After breakfast, served in the dining-room where the chandeliers gleamed with renewed brightness, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock in the library to discuss the case's conclusion. The room, with its rows of leather-bound books, felt less oppressive now, as if the truth had lifted a weight from its walls. Craddock, his notebook closed for once, leaned back in his chair, his expression a blend of exhaustion and admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head, "I don't know how you do it. That business with Miss Harcourt, getting her to confess like that, without so much as raising your voice, you've a gift and no mistake." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Inspector, it's no gift, just a matter of listening to people, and perhaps understanding a little of their hearts. Miss Harcourt was carrying such a heavy load, anger, guilt, shame. It only needed a gentle push to bring it out." Craddock nodded, jotting a final note. "The lab confirmed the cyanide on the cup's rim, just as you thought. Miss Harcourt's statement matches the evidence. She bought the poison in London, applied it that morning when Reed was out of the tea-room. She's cooperating fully, though she's still insisting she only meant to frighten Sir Henry." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts turning over the confession. Miss Harcourt's motive, rooted in the old family feud, had been clear, but her attempt to frame Clara Grayson revealed a cunning that belied her tearful remorse. "It's a sad thing, Inspector," she said, "when resentment festers so long it turns to poison. But I believe she spoke the truth about her intent. She misjudged the dose, and now she must face the consequences. The drawing room, where the guests gathered that afternoon, was a study in contrasts. Lady Evelyn, her indigo silk replaced by a simple gray dress, presided over tea with a quiet dignity, her hands steadier now that the shadow of suspicion had lifted. She spoke of simplifying future gatherings, her voice carrying a resolve to move forward. "This house has seen enough of ceremony," she said, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of gratitude. "Perhaps it's time for plainer pleasures." Miss Marple nodded, noting the absence of the tremor that had marked Lady Evelyn's hands during the crisis. The financial strain on Ashford Hall remained, but with Miss Harcourt's arrest, the threat of scandal had eased, offering a chance to rebuild. Clara Grayson, her black dress softened by a lace collar, sat near the window, her expression distant but no longer strained. The rumors of her London lover, confirmed by the police's inquiries into Charles Wentworth, had been discreetly set aside, as no evidence linked her to the crime. She spoke quietly of returning to London, her voice tinged with a resolve that suggested a new chapter. "Henry would have wanted me to move on," she said, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's briefly, as if seeking approval. Miss Marple, ever kind, offered a smile, though her mind noted the young widow's haste to leave Ashford Hall. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such swift departures before, often a sign of a heart eager to escape scrutiny, or simply to heal. Mr. Reed, serving tea with his customary silence, seemed to have regained his invisibility, his shadowed past no longer a focal point. Miss Marple watched him, recalling the village gossip about his dismissal from Lord Pennington's estate. His loyalty to Lady Evelyn had held firm, and with Miss Harcourt's confession, his role in the ceremony was cleared of suspicion. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, sensed that Reed's secrets, though unrelated to the murder, would remain his own, buried beneath his impeccable service. As evening approached, Miss Marple took a final turn in the gardens, the roses now fading but still fragrant. The resolution of the case brought a quiet satisfaction, but also a pang of sadness, for the pain that had driven Miss Harcourt to such an act. She thought of a case in her village where a spurned suitor's jealousy had led to a poisoned bottle of wine, his regret as palpable as Miss Harcourt's tears. The tea ceremony, meant to foster harmony, had instead exposed the fractures in human hearts, and Miss Marple, with her gentle probing, had brought them to light. She paused by the fountain, its soft trickle a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts, and reflected on the power of small clues. The residue on a cup, a glance in a garden, a confession drawn out by kindness. Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock preparing to leave, his team packing up their equipment. "We'll wrap things up here, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Thanks to you, we've got our culprit, and the case is airtight. You ever think of joining the force?" She laughed softly, her needles clicking. "Oh, Inspector, I'm far too old for that. I'll leave the arrests to you and keep to my knitting." He grinned, shaking his head, and Miss Marple watched him go, knowing that her role, though unofficial, had been as vital as his. As she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the drawing room, her knitting nearly complete. The house was quieter now, its occupants finding their way back to routine. Lady Evelyn's resolve, Clara's departure, Reed's silent loyalty, all spoke of lives moving forward, shaped but not broken by the tragedy. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the tea ceremony, its elegance marred by a single act of vengeance. The truth, she knew, was often a bitter brew, but bringing it to light was a service to justice, however quietly performed. Chapter 12. A Quiet Reflection. The 8th day at Ashford Hall marked Miss Jane Marple's departure, and the morning carried a serene stillness, as if the estate, purged of its dark secret, had settled into a gentle truce with the past. The sun, now a steady presence, bathed the lawns in a soft golden light, and the air held the crisp promise of autumn. Miss Marple, her modest suitcase packed, sat in her cottage at St. Mary Mead, having returned the previous evening. The familiar comforts of her parlor, lace curtains, a well-worn armchair, the faint scent of lavender, enveloped her as she took up her knitting, the final rose of a shawl nearing completion. Her mind, however, lingered on the events at Ashford Hall, the tea ceremony that had unraveled into tragedy, and the human frailties it had exposed. With her needles clicking rhythmically, she reflected on the case, her thoughts weaving the final threads of understanding into a pattern as intricate as her stitches. The resolution of Sir Henry Grayson's murder had left St. Mary Mead abuzz with whispers, though Miss Marple, ever discreet, avoided the village gossip at the Red Lion and the post office. She had heard enough from Mrs. Norris and Mr. Baxter to know that Miss Lydia Harcourt's arrest had stirred both sympathy and censure among the locals. The old family feud, a tale of disinheritance and resentment, was retold with fresh vigor, but Miss Marple's role in uncovering the truth remained, as always, a quiet undercurrent, known only to those like Inspector Craddock who valued her insight. She thought of Miss Harcourt, now facing the consequences of her actions, her confession a mix of remorse and defiance. The young woman's intent to frighten rather than kill had been a miscalculation, born of a wound that had festered too long, and Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human nature, felt a pang of sorrow for her. Her thoughts turned to Lady Evelyn Ashford, whose dignity had held firm despite the strain of financial troubles and the scandal of a murder under her roof. The housekeeper's tales of mortgages and Sir Henry's potential investment had painted a picture of quiet desperation, but Miss Marple was satisfied that Lady Evelyn's hands, though trembling, were clean of cyanide. The hostesses resolved to simplify her gatherings, to step back from the grandeur of tradition, suggested a woman ready to adapt, to preserve Ashford Hall in her own way. Miss Marple recalled a case in her village where a proud widow had faced ruin but found redemption through humility, and she hoped Lady Evelyn would find a similar path. Clara Grayson, too, occupied Miss Marple's reflections. The young widow's departure for London, swift and unceremonious, had confirmed the rumors of a lover, though no evidence tied her to the crime. Her grief, Miss Marple believed, was genuine, but tinged with relief at the prospect of a new life. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such young women before, caught in marriages of convenience, their hearts yearning for freedom. Clara's glance at Miss Harcourt during the tea ceremony, a fleeting moment of suspicion, had been a clue misread by others but noted by Miss Marple, who understood that innocence could coexist with discontent. Mr. Thomas Reed, the silent servant, remained an enigma, his shadowed past a footnote rather than a key to the mystery. His loyalty to Lady Evelyn, unshaken by the scrutiny of the police, had been his shield, and Miss Marple suspected his secrets, whatever they were, would remain buried. She thought of a gardener in her village whose quiet demeanor hid a theft that was never proven, much like Reed's alleged misdeed at Lord Pennington's estate. Such men, she knew, carried their burdens in silence, their lives defined by service rather than scandal. The tea ceremony itself, with its promise of harmony, lingered in Miss Marple's mind as a poignant irony. Its precise rituals, meant to foster unity, had instead been the stage for a calculated act of vengeance. The residue on the teacup's rim, the faint trace of cyanide, had been the thread that led to Miss Harcourt, but it was the human heart, its grudges, its pains, that had woven the crime. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the power of small things, a glance, a tremor, a confession drawn out in a garden. In St. Mary Mead, she had solved many such mysteries, each a reminder that truth lay in the ordinary, the overlooked, the quietly human. As the fire crackled in her parlor, Miss Marple thought of Inspector Craddock, whose gruff admiration had warmed her departure from Ashford Hall. His final words, "You're a marvel, Miss Marple," had been a rare acknowledgment, but she needed no praise. Her satisfaction came from the clarity of truth, the restoration of order, however fleeting. She rose to make a cup of tea, her movements slow but deliberate, and as she waited for the kettle, she glanced at the shawl, nearly finished. Each stitch, like each clue, had been placed with care, building a whole from fragments. The murder at Ashford Hall, like her knitting, was complete, its pattern revealed through patience and observation. Settling back by the fire, Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth a contrast to the bitter memory of cyanide. St. Mary Mead, with its quiet lanes and familiar faces, was her world, but its lessons applied even to the grand halls of Ashford. People, she knew, were the same everywhere, driven by love, fear, or anger, their secrets hidden in plain sight. The tea ceremony had been a mirror, reflecting not harmony, but the fractures beneath, and Miss Marple, with her gentle probing, had brought them into focus. As her needles resumed their rhythm, she smiled softly, content in the knowledge that another mystery had been laid to rest, its truths as enduring as the village she called home.